Ashish. Thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. It's been a long-held intention to have a conversation with you, and finally, maybe because of lockdown and schedules being synced, it's So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes. So Ashish, want to start with where we are right now. It seems like a panic time. It seems like a total breakdown all around. There's a lot of sadness, grief, fear in me personally, and all around also. So just trying to make a sense of this, and how's this seeming to you from the perspective of all these decades that you have spent doing what you have done? What is happening, and how does one make sense of this?
Yeah, Abhishek, I think I don't know how long it's going to take for individual and collective traumas of this to uh, pan out in all sorts of different ways over the next few years, maybe the next few decades. I'm thinking even, for instance, of children who are growing up in this atmosphere who may not be personally affected, but obviously are seeing, hearing, and being impacted in various ways, and what that means for when they're older. Um, I think, at least the way I'm trying to look at this, beyond the health uh, epidemic and all the sort of individual and collective losses we're seeing all around us, is I wouldn't say a breakdown of the system. I think it's, in a way, a logical extension of a system that's already broken in many different ways. We can think of it in three or four ways. One is, it is showing to us the consequences of ignoring the way in which we treat the rest of nature. We know, of course, scientists have shown us that the virus jumping into human beings itself as a result of ecological damage of various kinds, as have been many other pandemics or epidemics in the past. Um, but secondly, also, I think showing us the fault lines in a system and an economic system which creates enormous vulnerabilities amongst people, which doesn't really create relative or total self-reliance for basic needs, so that people are dependent on either the government or corporations or people very far away for their basic needs like food and water and energy and so on. Um, and I'll talk about the opposites that we're also seeing, but this is also so very clear, where you actually have millions or tens of millions of people being suddenly out of livelihoods or out of jobs, and lots and lots and lots of people not able to reach health facilities, etc. The third thing, I think, which is very clear, is the absolute, and I would say, criminal negligence on part of the state with regard to public health. This is something that health activists have been saying for a long, long, long time, that we need to pay much more attention to public health. We need to give it the attention, the budgets, the focus that it needs, and not simply say, well, the private sector will deal with it, because we know what's happening with the private sector now. Even, for instance, the vaccine apartheid we're seeing with regard to free in government hospitals, but having to pay in the private hospital, which is ridiculous. So that's also, I think, something that's, in a way, all of these are uh, they're built into the system. It's not like the system is breaking down. They're actually built into a fundamentally unequal, iniquitous, and unsustainable system. And we're seeing the manifestations of what that could be in the midst of a crisis. But the same thing will happen with some other crisis. Could be a climate crisis, could be a financial. 2008 was kind of there, and the climate crises as they come. The only difference here, I guess, would be that this is obviously global. I mean, it's global. It's affecting everybody, virtually everybody. Whereas with climate crises, they're kind of localized, but they might be happening in 100 places at the same time. So in that sense, they're also global. But yeah.
So, few things, Ashish, that I wanted to kind of open up a bit. The first thing you had said was in terms of our neglect of ecology, making conditions for the spread of these kind of viruses more easy and likely, and that you would attribute to the destruction of the biodiversity or to human beings consuming animals, or like what would you, if you could open that up a bit?
It's a combination of things. It's we know that, for instance, with some of the viruses or other sorts of diseases, vector-borne diseases that have happened in the past, it has been opening up of rainforests, for instance, where which people didn't even used to go to or would be very rarely entered into. But when you destroy it for anything like mining or logging or whatever, then you're actually releasing you're either creating imbalances or you're releasing organisms which have otherwise not really been in the human system. And then, of course, also the overexploitation, the industrial exploitation of animals. This is not really about Adivasis going and hunting animals and eating for their own consumption, which has been going on for millions of years or thousands of years. So that's not the issue. The issue here is the industrial scale consumption and exploitation of animals, either whether it is the sort of industrial animal husbandry, livestock farming, or it is large scale commercial hunting for feeding global markets. And it's this combination, which it's probably the latter, which is one of the origins of the COVID virus. But many of the previous ones have been through deforestation and other such things. And then the other factor there, which I should have mentioned in the beginning also, is that what economic globalization does, this mad global transportation of humans and materials, which has happened especially in the last 25, 30 years. It's like it's exploded, right? I mean, things are going back and forth at rocket pace all across the world. It just makes it, I mean, the virus is very happy because it just makes it so much easier for it to travel all across the world. Whereas if you had much more localized economies and much less of this incredible amount of trade and human um, mobility, then it would be so much more difficult for anything like this to travel. And even if it did, it would take much longer. So people would have more time to take precautions.
Yeah. Also, another thing that opened up for me when you were sharing this was, just as there has been deforestation and mining, at the human relations level, I feel capitalism, or whatever we call it, has been able to monetize communities and break them down, literally like a psychic or psychological deforestation. And almost seems like idea viruses also spread very fast because of homogeneity and the broadcast systems, and they behave in similar ways. Like, this is a physical virus, so perhaps the conversations alive. But if I think about idea viruses, like say Hindutva gripping the imagination of the country, and how homogeneity and certain set of conditions are allowing entities to latch on and start proliferating in unprecedented numbers, right? Like memes also now are, it's kind of a new reality, right? So I wonder whether, do you see us then being able to restore a little bit of balance both at these levels? Because again, I would say that if there would be communities where there would be diversity, then these idea viruses would not spread, because it would self-regulate. You would have a diverse set of people in the background, and it would kind of work out. uh, so just wondering if that kind of small, do you feel there is a scope of returning to small is beautiful in a system which is very clever at hiding its logic, hiding its harm, and showing off the gains? It's so clever, right? The system's so clever at doing that and pulling the smoke screen. So do you really see us being able to restore community, restore small, or using this opportunity to actually, I don't know, I mean, to bring that back into the conversation? That, yeah, just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I absolutely do. But before I get to that, I think because you've sort of touched on some of the underlying structures which is causing the three or four phenomenon I was talking about in terms of what this is, it's a sort of logical extension of the system. I didn't really define the system. So in that sense, you've already opened it up. And I think it's important for us to then recognizing what are these fundamental structures or relations that are causing these things in the first place. You mentioned capitalism, and that certainly is one of the biggest ones, especially in the last 100, 200, or maybe like 400 years, colonial times onwards. But also, of course, underlying that is patriarchy, racism, in the Indian context, casteism, all of which are probably much older, and what some people call statism, which is the concentration of power in the hands of the nation state, which we have kind of willingly given over in the name of democracy. So all of these and others, and then also underlying this very fundamentally, which kind of maybe is at the base of all of this, also is the um, is human-centeredness, is anthropocentrism, is the notion that we rule the earth, right? It's this typical modern science pyramid of human beings, pyramid of life with human beings right on top, and supposedly the most intelligent of all creatures. Whereas if you look at, for most parts of human history, people have thought of human beings as being one of a circle of life, right? Which one of maybe many, many, many species. So in that sense, the virus that's in our head, which you talked about, right, or what say Vandana Shiva calls the monocultures of the mind, is also about maybe 17th, 18th century onwards, the imposition of a particular way of thinking through colonialism of what is progress, and then more recently, what is development, right? So it's kind of predicated on this notion that we will be moving from hunting gathering to agriculture to manufacturing, etc., and now the digital age and what's coming next, who knows. And so it's sort of a linear progression that we will be going from traditional knowledge systems to modern science and technology. That XYZ, we will be going from situations where we didn't have many material, items, didn't own a lot of material items. We will be owning more and more and more. We will be going from these collective common systems, which are considered to be primitive and outmoded, to private property, etc. So all of these have become, they're not they're not facts. They're not facts of life. They're not like, okay, this is going to happen regardless of. They're actually normative things that this should happen. Right, and that's where I think we've got it so badly wrong, and that's why every country in the world except Bhutan, to a limited extent, thinks of economic growth, GDP, as being the ultimate goal of economic planning. Whereas, as we know, at least for the last 20-30 years, people have shown that economic growth, in fact, is not, forget about not being sustainable, because ecology, environment are still not considered core to all of this, but is not even meeting the needs of the vast majority of people, especially if you think of basic needs as including not just food and water and so on, but also dignity, voice, democratic spaces, good quality learning spaces, health, etc. And we see that for most parts of the world, and we see it again now with this COVID, that just that basic security is not met by this model of development, and certainly not by a globalized development in the way that we see it. So I totally agree with what you're saying, that there is a certain, but the crucial point here, and what you're talking about, the virus of the mind, is that even those who are badly affected, the victims of this process, are still dreaming the same dreams. And that's the incredible brainwashing that's happened over the last couple of 100 years, and especially the last 70-80 years of so-called development, is that we, even if I'm being displaced, persecuted, whatever, I will still be saying, oh no, but maybe, yeah, okay, today it was bad luck for me. Tomorrow, hopefully I will be able to make money or become famous or get into a IAS position or whatever, or join a big corporation. That person has done it from my village, so why can't I also do it? So it's the what I say is, it's the oppressed are dreaming the dreams of the oppressors, and that's something fundamentally that we have to transform. Now, with the question of, is there then hope to transform in the midst of this kind of multiple crises? and the underlying factors behind the crisis. I think so, yes, because I think what's happening is that I think the flaws in the system, the fundamental flaws in the system, not the superficial symptoms, but the fundamental flaws in the system, the structural flaws, are becoming more and more visible as people face, and especially in the last year and a half, as people have faced the kind of crises they've faced, where they've had to walk back 1,000 kilometers home, or they've seen their beloved ones dying outside a hospital that simply doesn't have the wherewithal, not because the government doesn't have the money, but because it's not put the money into it, into public health, uh, or XYZ, you actually begin to, at least 3 or 4 out of 10 people will be asking themselves the questions, why is this happening? And this is where then public discussion, debate becomes so very important, where people are able to point out that this is happening not simply because of inefficiency and corruption, but it's happening because of the fundamental flaws in the system. I just wrote this article 2 days back, 3 days back in the Indian Express, where I was pointing to the fact that the informalization of India's workforce, not the informal sector, which is still self-reliant, like Adivasis in a good intact forest, etc., or coastal fishing communities where the coast and the marine areas are still intact. But the rest of the informal economy is deliberately like that. It is deliberately made to be insecure, because then you will not be able to stand up to the exploitation that you're suffering. So when these sorts of things become more and more visible, people do look for alternatives. And that's again where I think our work becomes so very important, to be able to show that, look, here are 100 places where people have found those alternatives. Either they've sustained some of their old systems because they find that they're relevant today, or they've created new ones or hybrids. And we have been telling the stories of what we call the extraordinary work of ordinary in inverted commas, ordinary people, through this 1.5 years of the pandemic, precisely to be able to tell people that, look, here's a village that has been unaffected because of XYZ. Here's an urban community that has been able to survive better because of XYZ. And then what are the lessons that we can learn from that, for localized self-reliance, for much more autonomy, much more true freedom, but also much more expressions of solidarity with each other, and not just living selfish, individualized lives. So I am certainly hopeful that we will be learning much more from this. That doesn't mean that overnight things are going to change. But I think crises like this, the Greek origin of the word crisis is krisis, which means opportunity. Yes. So in that sense, every crisis is an enormous opportunity if we are able to use it.
Yeah, so is this one, I hope. So Ashish, I wanted to run my model or my picture of the system by you and see which pieces of that might be missing. In the sense that, so let me just share it and then hear your response. So I see all these systems latching onto a very basic human fear or greed, like latching onto something very basic, whether it's capitalism or patriarchy. They latch onto a very basic human instinct that is primal, and then creating stories that further that meme, right? So capitalism may latch onto self-preservation and then create a entire story about how working your way up is a way. And there is something about that on one end. On the other end, the way it plays with boundaries, where there's tight boundaries around money. No money can fall from one person's account to the other, or tight boundaries around people, but very loose boundaries around natural resources where you can encroach and keep pushing those boundaries. So very clever at that, and very clever at kind of building these smoke screens and consensus, right? Like Davos consensus, or like very good at consensus building, and almost in a self-reinforcing loop, right? Like it just everything feeds onto each other. Just the more you create misinformation and consensus, which further drives people into selfishness, and then it kind of creates that loop which so many people seem to be stuck in. Uh, and you have seen alternatives also. So obviously there is something in these people. I don't know if there is something common in these people, some imagination, some capacity to rise beyond these primal instincts, that unlocks their imagination. So two questions I have. One is that in this picture of the system where it latches onto something very uh, base, create stories and misinformation and reinforcing loops, uh, that for me seemed to be, and there is something there, right? Like one thought one of these days I had was how capitalism has been able to attach time and money together. Like I was reflecting on why I was feeling so restless, and it's almost like if I waste my time, I'm wasting money, and if I'm wasting money, my chances of survival are gone. So no doubt I was in a race because there is interest on money, there is hourly wages. Like some of these things have gone so deep into my schooling, and again, I was having a conversation with someone else from another generation. I said that we are the well-conditioned generation. I was 10 years old when 1992 happened, so it's almost like my entire education has been a liberalization conditioning. Like, okay, 10 years, 92 has happened, and you slowly learn to, become special, have Pepsi. So it almost feels like the system's educated us so deeply. So two questions. One is that in this picture of the system, am I missing something? uh, uh, or what would you kind of, what stands out for you in this picture? And two is when you have met people who've been able to resist this system creatively, constructively, especially rather than out of frustration or anger, is there some attitude, something about them that you've seen that can actually start being shared and start being kind of spread around?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole lot of very complex things, and I don't even necessarily feel competent to to address all of those. But okay, some additional thoughts to the ones that you've given. So this is actually turning out to be a good conversation in that sense. So I think you're absolutely right. The system, the capitalist system, or and as I said, underlying that also things like patriarchy and racism and so on, uh, tend to appeal to and are very good at getting straight to those parts of our beings which are about individual self-preservation, and I'm making a difference here between individual and collective self-preservation,
Yeah.
which are about individual selfishness, and the highs, the kicks that we get by either becoming suddenly overnight famous or suddenly overnight getting a lot of power over others, or suddenly getting very rich, which is, and the three are in some sense also connected, right? Um, but if one thinks of human beings as complex beings which are not, uh, which don't have only these elements, but also have the elements of collective self-preservation, of solidarity, of love, of generosity, of being able to uh, get out of my comfort zone and help somebody else, etc. It what occurs to me is that in the last few decades or maybe couple of centuries, uh, the and going back to what I was saying earlier about what do we think of as progress and development, what do we think of, I mean, what is it to be human, right? The kind of westernized modernity and of course along with that capitalism, it's a patriarchy and all of that that has happened in all of our lives. You mentioned your schooling. It was probably less so in my schooling, but it is already beginning to come. In yours it was much stronger. That these notions, and therefore that part of us which they wanted to appeal to gets um, triggered, gets further reinforced, uh, and even if we don't necessarily make it to those dreams, as I said earlier, we see another five people who made it and we say, oh, we will also be able to get there, right? So that's what the system does to us. But the system can also, and that's what we're seeing in localized or smaller scale, because it's so far not part of the sort of mega system, can also appeal to let's say, for want of a better word, the better part of us. And that's what I see in all the fantastic alternative initiatives that we've been either part of or have been lucky enough to document, is I think three or four things happen. One is the realization that self-preservation is also possible, or much more possible, when the collective good is met. Yeah, because beyond a point, you do need somebody else. You can't, unless you're a monk living in a cave somewhere in the Himalayas, you cannot live alone. You have, you are a, we are all collective beings in one way or the other, right? And so if there's a atmosphere around us which is actually telling me that I am, the Ubuntu philosophy of Southern Africa, that I am because we are, then I am able to, that part of me gets activated, where I see that if somebody else is suffering, I want to try and help. And if I have myself suffered and somebody else has helped me, then that gets even more stronger. So one is that. The second is, so the importance of collective self-preservation. And I think there's some very interesting scientific work also that's coming up in the last few years, which is debunking the distorted way in which Darwin has been interpreted. Darwin's interpretation is, I mean, the interpretation of Darwin is survival of the fittest, means the individualization and selfishness and might, physical might, or military might, or whatever. Whereas in fact, I think to some extent he himself did, but subsequently people like Lynn Margulis, and then this recent work on how forests, how a living forest behaves, is showing that actually solidarity and collective work is a much more important, if at least as important, if not much more important, way of evolution and of survival than individual self-preservation and might, etc. Right? So working together actually is a far more powerful way of surviving, evolving, thriving. So there's no reason that this cannot actually come, and it's been there for most parts of human history also. It's just that it's been significantly lost in this recent phase. The second, I think, important thing is what some people have called ecological intelligence. The realization that any act that I do, any way in which I behave, anything that I consume has implications. Now, and this is why, for instance, I think a lot of the transformations are much stronger in a rural community than in urban communities, at least in India, is because the feedback loops are much stronger. So when you, for instance, poison a river with pesticides or whatever, or you cut down a forest, there will be impacts on the larger scale, but there will also be some impacts on that micro scale, and you see it, you feel it, right? You overhunted your forest and you see it. The next generation sees that, okay, I have nothing left to hunt. This is a common phenomenon in Nagaland, for instance, which is why there's so much of a community conservation movement there now. Or you cut down the catchment forest, and now all the soil is washing down, and there isn't enough water in the summer. So those kinds of immediate feedback loops create an ecological intelligence, or revive an ecological intelligence that was there but may have been lost in modern times. And you can do that with urban populations through awareness, right? Because the immediate feedback loops may not be there. Now they're beginning to be there with things like pollution. And with climate, even if the cause is somewhere, half the world across, but I'm feeling it because suddenly there's a flood in my city, or a drought, or a cyclone, or now COVID. So I think that kind of ecological intelligence, the more we're able to create it. So when you were growing up in school, suppose, for instance, all your teachers were telling you, all your textbooks were telling you about the fact that we are part of nature, and that what we do to nature does hit back on us, or we are part of collective human societies, and what we do to other people, knowingly or unknowingly, will at some point hit back at us. Then I think you would have, you as in your generation, would have grown up to be much more sensitive. You anyway grew up to be more sensitive. Something else must have happened in your life, not your textbooks, I'm sure. But we would all be then, in that sense, much more ecologically intelligent, but also ecologically concerned, and I shouldn't say wise, because that's too big a word, but certainly more aware of what's happening. Another thing you talked about was the consensus. And yes, the system has been extremely good at creating some kind of a consensus around what's a good life, or what is development, etc., right? But to my mind, I think it's a very false consensus. It's a forced consensus. It's not a consensus that's built on individual experience or collective experience. It's coming from the outside and it's set in my mind, and then I just believe it, right? Or in my heart, and I just believe. So, whereas in the alternative initiatives, what we see is that that false consensus is strongly challenged. It is interrogated, it is questioned, and people then say, in fact, this is not the so-called consensus that we want to go. We have another kind of consensus, which is that we will protect our forests, we will make sure that everybody is getting benefits from it, we will respect the earth and not pump chemical pesticides into it, etc. So I think consensus, there are many different ways of building it, and we have to find creative ways in which we can challenge this false consensus and actually build what I think would be much more genuine, meaningful, real consensus about ways of living and doing things. And again, there are lots of examples, which I don't need to go into, as you said, most of you are aware.
True. So what you shared, Ashish, opened up a couple of things for me. I think one is that the education is also just the schooling is also of the elite. Like in my school, because I was a topper and a head boy, I would go around with a sash and I would not have to move. I mean, I could move and special privileges, and it was so deeply schooled. And then with my MBA, I learned the language of the corporate world, the business world, and literally a way of behavior, not only language, but discourse. And so I can slide into it and become a part of it. And just even unschooling all of that, that I am special and I deserve it. And of course, it is me. And I've also been into the self-help zone like forever, ever since. And that self-help obsession of how do I max out my life and how to win friends, influence people. And so all that, I think, so one thing I'm realizing is that the system is not only schooled the oppressed, but also the oppressors in feeling legitimate about that oppression and feeling like, okay, this is how things are. It's so obvious. So I think that's one thing that came to me. Just naming them, because those are also not expecting us to go into those threads, but just naming them out. The other was, I think, the assumption that suffering is bad. I think this
Can I,
almost like
Avi, sorry,
hmm,
just sorry to interrupt you, but just as a aside, or maybe not an aside, I think it's important. Despite everything you went through in school and MBA and so on, which was where the system was telling you how to behave, you turned out to be different. What made that happen? Because that could give us clues on where is it that we should also, apart from the education system, etc., where else is it that we should focus, where people are actually able to see the other side of the story, and the flaws and the fakeness of the system and what it's telling us.
yeah, I reflected, I mean, a few things for that. I think one is at 10, just as whatever the globalization, liberalization was happening, the Earth Summit was also happening in 1992. And Bittu Sehgal, Sanctuary Magazine, and Cub Club. And so there was a seeding of that at the same time at a very early stage. It's like now 30 years now that, and Enron dam was there. So I didn't understand complex issues, but I knew kind of, okay, maybe the dam is wrong. So I was writing the local newsletter about that and banning zoos. And also, I feel one is a very early start was one thing that definitely helped. The other is a very wide exposure. So even before my MBA, for example, I was at Asia Social Forum, which for the first time it opened me up to a world because I was a commerce student in Bombay. So Asia Social Forum in Hyderabad was like a whole different world. And even a stint with RSS, I did 9 months with RSS during college to experience that side of the world as well. And then the libertarian. So it's been, and the UN process by Rio plus 20, I was mobile and I went to New York and Brazil and so there's been a long exposure across and a constant saying that, oh, this is not it, this is not it, this is not it, this is not it. Like it's taken a long time to say, okay, this will not, this is not it, this is not it, kind of an ongoing journey. So I think an early start, exposure, access to people also, I would say, like access to people like you, who first I spotted in newspaper columns, but then I reached out and took the risk, because when you see someone in a newspaper column, it just feels like it does feel like intimidating, like book author and so on. And then realizing that, everybody is so approachable in the space, and if anything, they're willing to support. So I felt like I had access to elders at the right time. I mean, elders is a qualified word, but people who walked, and that has saved me a lot of unnecessary heartache. Like I've got the well in advance the talim to do this. So I think those two, three things come to me. I think even at a time when we met early on, you shared your story about how you shifted from resistance to alternatives
Mm.
at some stage, and that almost like I feel like that I could trust that story and say, yeah, I mean, this makes sense, and that did something. It was a simple story, but coming from somebody who's done so many decades and reflected, I would say it cut short a chunk of my yeah, and all these things have really, really helped. So I think
Mm.
that
Sure. I think, I mean, what this brings to us, and this is probably a common story with variations, obviously, for a lot of people who are in our space. Some being lucky enough to have done that, some having struggled to be able to, get these spaces, etc. I think it basically opens up a whole line of, which I know that you people have already been doing, sort of whole line of inquiry and exploration on how do we make these sorts of spaces much more systematically available, so that they're not just chance, systematically available to young people. But yeah, anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, sorry, you were saying a second point.
Yeah, I was saying the other thing that had opened up for me is suffering is bad and embarrassing. It's almost like if I don't turn on the AC, then I'm losing in life because now I don't have AC. Like uh, on one hand, that suffering is bad, and the endless capacity of the private model to keep privatizing. Like, okay, you know what? You can have private security. You don't need to rely on the police. Like the middle class has been bribed or has learned to bribe its way out of not having to ask for services because the private establishment is standing there and saying, hey, you know what, don't need to engage with the system. We'll give you this, we'll give you private tankers, we'll give you private security, we'll give you air conditioning. So it's almost like if the middle class, if only the middle class would have engaged more with the government, I feel the mechanisms would have been more greased because they are more quote unquote educated or they're more demanding. But I feel like making suffering bad and then putting a price to everything and selling it, like I feel the middle class got co-opted very badly in this whole thing. Like they're also touted as the biggest beneficiaries, and of course it accumulated a lot of privilege. But I feel like something, that moral rot set in, something about that whole selfishness and the whole, it's so hard to make a housing society, for example, work, right? Like get a housing society on a consensus, like 100% consensus in a housing society. I think the first ever housing society in India that does that should be given like one huge award. It's just so impossible. So I feel this whole combination of suffering is bad, and therefore I have to care for myself and I have to win. I think some of that has seeped in really badly. So that was kind of another thing that was coming to me. Yeah, yeah. I think
I
those.
think this is no, you're right. I think this is related to two things which we need to reflect on. One is the systematic downgrading of physical work.
Hmm.
Of course, this has more ancient roots in the caste system itself, so that those who are doing the physical work were the lower castes, etc. But it's certainly very much there in the system also, the modern system also, the way it, for instance, what it pays to a farmer versus what it pays to somebody who writes about farming. Um, what it pays to a cook versus somebody who writes in the columns about food, etc. So the so-called higher status and higher rewards to the intellectual vis-a-vis the physical laborer is also very much part of this system. It's part of both caste and the capitalist system, and also, of course, gender hierarchies come into that. So that doing housework is lower status, unpaid, etc. Whereas if you're going to an office, then you're the worker. So rather than, I mean, you're the breadwinner, so to speak. So I think this is one part of it. The other is that I wrote an article a few years back on the the fatal addiction of convenience, and the way in which we have increasingly tried to mold our lives, and the system has very much helped us there, um, towards more convenience. Okay, so when you were saying, for instance, the trend towards privatization, it is seductive precisely because I don't then have to make the effort of uh, doing the collective work, for instance, to maintain my housing society. I can just give it over to some private
And
sector.
that effort is bad and it must be minimized at all costs, right? Like
Correct, correct,
minimize your effort, optimize it as much as you can.
correct. And again, but that's mostly,
Self.
or not all, but mostly to do with physical labor
Hmm.
or mechanical
Right,
labor or
right,
whatever,
right.
right? So
Yeah,
which you think is boring or is hard
yeah,
work, or
yeah,
I can't
yeah.
be out in the sun and doing it, blah blah blah, all that. So so that comes from this notion, which has been building up over decades or maybe centuries also, of what is good work, or what is work, and then what is leisure. And in order to, and this goes back to what you said earlier also about time and money, the connection between time and money, also how we look at time in general, and how my time is worth much more than somebody else's time, and so therefore I can't be cleaning the streets, or I can't be mechanically entering something into some data into it. I'll just give it over to somebody else to do it, while I'll be actually doing the more creative, supposedly, work sitting at my home. So I think all of this comes in, which relates to the fundamental structures of inequality and oppression in our society. Now, how do we deal with this issue of convenience? The example I gave in that article, which I started off with, was where you have, say, in a railway station or an airport, you've got the escalator and then you have the stairs. And even the most fittest of people, I notice, will usually take the escalator, even if they're not carrying any luggage, right? No reason. And then they'll go to a gym to stay fit. So there is something about this notion of what is convenient, especially where somebody else is giving me that convenience. If as a community I had to build those systems and I had to put in the work and the money to build those systems, I would be thinking about this a little bit more strongly. For instance, let's take energy as an example. Right now, I switch on the light, I put my what's it called, mixie into the plug point, and magic, there's electricity there. Now, supposing there was localization and my community is the one that is producing the energy, in which all of us were giving some amount of time and effort and whatever that makes it going, I would think twice before using that energy. I would say, oh, maybe I can do this one I can do with my hand. I don't actually need to use a electric mixie. Um, and this again also goes back to the ecological food, sorry, the loops, the feedback
Feedback
loops
loops.
thing. Yeah. So how do we
In
think of,
fact,
what
just
do we,
sorry, Ashish, one more thing I on feedback loops that came to me is that in Mumbai, there is a island city surcharge which makes sure that there is uninterrupted power forever. So it's only when I step out of Mumbai and see a power failure, I'm like, oh, okay, this happens. Because
yeah.
Mumbai, they have taken away that feedback loop entirely. Like there is no feedback loop. Like you will never lose power. So it's that extreme, like really extreme.
And people actually not just get used to it, but they think of it as an entitlement.
True. Like proud of it. I can
Yeah.
be
No, and I
yeah,
have a right to 24 hours power supply. Who,
yeah,
how dare somebody else, stop it
yeah.
without actually even thinking of where it's coming from, what is the effort going into
Yeah.
it, what's the ecological consequences, social consequences, etc. Um, but so, how does one tackle this issue of convenience? I think is a very difficult one, and it's a big one. You can take cycling as another example. It is absolutely fine for somebody to cycle 2-3 kilometers and go and do your shopping, or go to work or whatever, and come back. There's 90-80% of the population can do it, right? Okay, those who are very old, or too young, or who have physical disabilities, no, but others can. But yet we will take a two-wheeler, or a car, or whatever, because it just means pushing the pedal rather than making that physical effort. And then again we'll come back and go to a gym now. So how does one change that? I think one way to change it is the earlier thing about ecological and social intelligence. What is the consequence of my convenience on somebody else, and how am I inconveniencing somebody else because of my convenience? This is something most of us don't realize, and I think we just need much more better education and awareness with regard to this. Second, how do you think of harder ways of doing things as being not just acceptable but also cool? Why is it that in Europe, businessmen in three-piece suits, politicians, are cycling to work? It's not inconvenient. I mean, they could certainly, and these are people who can afford a car. But you create a certain atmosphere of saying, well, yeah, it's cool to cycle, or yeah, okay, this is how I'm going to get stay healthier. But you also then create the systems that make the cycling safe, right?
Yes.
So it is this individual choice which is also in some sense being determined by the system of what it's telling me, but then also the systemic infrastructures that would be
Yes.
needed for me to not have to work 100 times harder, maybe
Right.
twice as hard or
Yeah.
thrice as
Yeah.
hard, but
Yeah.
not 100 times harder, and where it would be not unsafe for me. And you would find that people will then go into that. They will actually start doing that. And last point here is how those choices can also be made more convenient, in the sense that if I have to, let's say, if I want to buy organic food, right? But there's only 2 shops in the city. For my everyday consumption, I'm going to go to the nearby thing and buy the chemical laden stuff, right? But if every neighborhood actually had an organic shop and farmers were coming and selling it to me, I would find it convenient to actually
Right.
do what
Yeah.
would be the right thing for the environment and
Yeah.
for myself.
Yeah.
So I think these are all things, factors that
True.
we need to look at and change.
Yeah. I want to own up this convenience piece, Ashish, a bit and unpack it in my own zen. So, for example, there was a time when I opted for a computer that would boot instantly rather than wait for 30 seconds. Because that, and when I observe more closely, it is literally brain chemistry that is like there is a release of serotonin that I'm after, or whatever dopamine. The brain chemistry is like that. And even with WhatsApp, social media, the whole thing, it's really wired for the brain chemistry to go on an overdrive. And at one stage, when I was trying to relax myself over a break, I realized that my body is in a constant state of slight tension because you never know where a message will hit from you. And for an experiment, I had installed a dating app just to see what that does for a few days. And that is like one more degree because now you're like, you can get a mating signal from anywhere, like a dating signal of a potential. So it's very subtle, but it's really brain chemistry is being toyed around with, right, with tech. And also when you talk about convenience on one convenience, it's literally like on the other end, big tech is tweaking your brain chemistry and teaching you to be more and more impatient, or increasing the threshold of entertainment. For example, in Netflix now, it's so common to see gruesome violence. It's almost like small violence is no longer going to shake you, so like let all your body organs be out, or like immense amounts of sex, for example, and like all out. So it seems that there is a reverse race. So that was one kind of point that I wanted to talk, and how therefore at a micro level big tech is doing what it's doing. And of course macro level is a whole different question, so that's a huge domain in itself. um, but I think my deeper inquiry then, I don't know if it's linked, but I think in a way it is linked, is about truth, right? So what is truth and how hard it has become to determine truth? Because I feel like more than the air pollution is the information pollution, right? In this ecology, it's so hard to make sense of what is really true, because again the same brain chemistry seeks certain type of news and almost like entertainment. Like I literally feel like as Netflix gets more entertaining, news has to keep up. And it's like everybody's gone into a passive viewer mode because they're so used to being in the viewer mode that now they're viewing COVID also from a viewer mode, except it's come to their homes, but other and shaken them maybe. But otherwise, so I feel like this whole
phenomenon of big tech screwing at an individual level, influencing governments at the large level and results of those, and making truth more and more inaccessible, sensing more and more difficult. I think this phenomenon, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this whole thing that's unfolding.
Yeah, I think, Kosh, you're touching so many different aspects of a very complex reality. I'm also feeling a bit at sea here, but yeah, I think these are fascinating things, and very scary and worrying also. So let's take the time issue. Earlier, you'd said about time and money being conflated by the system. I think it's beyond that. I think it's also how we view time in a linear way. That's what, again, Western modernity has told us, that time is linear. There's past, present, and future, and we should always be moving away from the past and going into the future. And that connects to the other linear things that I spoke about earlier, which is what gives us the thing saying that if I am taking 5 minutes off from work or from being on the computer or whatever it is, I am in some sense going against progress. It's not just about money. In some sense, it's I'm going against progress. I'm going against development, including my own, right? And I'm wasting time. Now, this whole notion of wasting time, and I do that myself, so I know it very well. Just like you do, I also have the same sort of sometimes tension. There's an interesting experiment I've been trying. It's something anybody can do. There's a app called Stretchly. There are many apps like that. There's an app called Stretchly, which is meant to save your eyes, essentially, basically, that you don't keep staring at the screen. So every few minutes, it will tell me, take a minute off, or every half an hour, it says 5 minutes off, go stretch, go make a coffee, go whatever, XYZ. Now, when I first put that on, I was resisting it because there's a override function. You can override it. Say, okay, skip this break, or tell me after half an hour or whatever it is. And then I started realizing, but that's stupid. I put it for myself, and then I'm overriding it. What's the point? So then I actually started following it. In the last few weeks, I've actually been assiduously following it. And so every few minutes, I am looking away. I'm doing something else. When the 5-minute breaks happen, I go and do my doodling of masks, or my doodling of t-shirts, or do it on paper.
Nice.
Or I know that there are things that are pending in the house. I haven't dusted a particular shelf, or I haven't cleaned those books for a long time, or I haven't XYZ. There's so many things that one can do, which is not work of the kind that is going to earn me fame and profits and somebody else's appreciation, or which just, I want to do. So I think we need to find ways to do that. Now, this is an app that makes me do it. They could, because I don't have the self-discipline. But if I had the self-discipline, I would do it myself, right? And what that does is it actually enables us to be creative in other spheres. And I think that's another thing that the system is doing to us. It's telling us you are productive only in this one sense. You're productive as a writer. You're productive as a farmer. You're productive as a whatever, XYZ, right? Instead of actually telling us that you could be productive and creative in 10 different ways. There's no reason why you cannot also be an artist if you're a farmer, or a writer if you're a farmer. Or, I think Marx has this famous quote about, I'm a critic in the morning and something else in the afternoon and something else in the evening, in that ideal system. Gandhi, of course, spoke about it all the time. So I think this is, we need to get, and this is again partly related to the education system, how people are being brought up, what kids are being told as to what is good in their life, etc., etc. Don't waste time, don't cry, don't this, don't that. Whereas if we were growing up in a system in which we were in fact told that it's fine if you're just staring out of the window. If it's if you have your own way of drawing, that's fine. You don't have to be you don't have to follow set system of what is art, and that it's fine if you want to try out 5 different things rather than spend 10 hours being just one a classical singer or a whatever. Then the whole childhood is spent just saying, I am going to become this, and when I grow up. So That's about time, and I think it also has this notions of what is creativity, what is freedom, etc. On the truth part, way more complex, and I certainly don't have the truth there. Is that I think this is partly, at least, also related to the feedback loops. When we are in a global system, there's no way we can understand what the truth is, right? So if 10 scientists are telling me one thing and another 10 are telling me something else, how would I know? There's no way I can tell, right? And the system always has those 10 scientists who are going to tell me what the system wants to hear. There is no climate change, there is no XYZ, right? Or the Hindutva lobby telling me that this is all because of Muslims, and they'll find 20 stories to show to me on my social media channels to convince me that that's the truth. But if we were living much more localized lives, where at least like for basic needs, for basic social relations, we had some kind of a face-to-face interaction, right? Not completely, that's impossible, but at least for many of the basic things in life, then I would be experiencing the truth to myself. And even if there was something like climate change, which I am not which is emanating 1,000 kilometers away from me, that community there, which is experiencing the issues and with whom I could be in touch, and that's where maybe global communications would be useful, would tell me that, look, it's in our area that there are these enormous emissions by this power station, which possibly is what's causing climate crisis in your area. And you wouldn't have a mediator in between, a CNN or a Times Now or whatever, who is telling me that no, you're first of all, you don't have any climate crisis, this is something else, or that, yeah, okay, it is a climate crisis, but it's caused by XYZ. So I think we need to figure that out. We need to figure out how these localizations thing, along with the global connections between localized communities without mediators, can take place. And I think then we would probably have a much better grasp on what the truth is.
What's going on. So I wanted to move to another, related, but another point, that in a world where truth is so hard to discover and negotiate, I wanted to move to the role of moral power. And I've been asking, I always ask myself as an MBA, where is the leverage? Where is the leverage? How where is the leverage? And I think one of my answers that seems to be coming up is moral power. And I'll just give a little bit of background because I want to hear what you have to say about it. In the sense, one of the things our elders have told me is that right after independence, civil society was at its peak in moral power. Nehru sent the 5-year plan to Vinoba and would consult actively, and that civil society was like a pillar of conscience and so on. And then movements were happening in 60s and 70s, but since then donors coming in, and then a lot of movements getting co-opted with becoming NGOs and CSR funding, and slowly the moral ground on which you stand and say this is not okay kind of starts depleting perhaps. And uh, and therefore just wondering whether we have any more moral standing left at a macro level is one. And I think at a micro level also, I must say, like, for example, and this is between us, right, in the sense that you, from what I gather, you don't use a mobile phone, and is that right? You don't, right, Ashish? Or like a mobile phone which is not WhatsApp mobile, a non-WhatsApp
No,
mobile phone?
it's not a smart. I do have a phone. It's not a smartphone. No WhatsApp.
Yeah.
No apps, etc. And I use it only for things like OTP, big booking tickets, and all of that.
Right.
So not even as a phone mostly.
So now it's a small action, but the moral force it's able to exert is immense, right? So for me, for example, I'm like, Ashish can anchor or manage like a network like Vikalp Sangam without WhatsApp. And that means it is possible. And so there is a value of moral pressure also, right? Like you don't have to do anything or to say anything, but just your actions, if it's an interconnected web, also exert a subtle moral power, right? So just holding that as a question on one end. On the other end, I also see a lot of my friends kind of avoiding or staying away from me, because if they get in touch with me, they almost feel an obligation to, like, I've almost seen like they have a obligation to somehow share what they're doing good for the world, or somehow even without me saying anything, they feel like they need to justify their existence to me in some strange way. Like there is something going on in that realm, at the personal and the macro level. So I think question to you would be, one is, are you in touch with the moral power, for example, someone like you exerts, and is it conscious, unconscious, and is there a leverage you see there at a macro level? How do we kind of restore civil society moral power? Because I wonder whether we have ever will have the numbers that, say, a political party has, but morals, on the other hand, a handful of people can actually be those voices, right? Like Anna Hazare perhaps was a voice, or like, is there a space on that? So just want to have your take on moral power, personal and macro.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would use the word ethics, ethical power rather than moral, because uh, partly for strategic reasons. I think one of the things that happened, certainly I remember when I was in school, used to have those moral science or
Yeah.
whatever stuff, and obviously most of us would rebel against it, because like, it was being rammed down our throats that Gandhiji always spoke the truth, so you must always speak the truth, blah blah blah, all that. And rather than actually telling us stories of how people like Gandhi or everybody else dealt with the issue of honesty and dishonesty, it was just this bland stuff being rammed down our throats. And so the word moral sometimes it's the whole moralizing thing gets very problematic. So I, I don't have a
Ethics.
yeah, I don't have a fundamental, I mean, sort of a inherent problem with it, but I would much rather prefer the word ethics or ethical principles or ethical values. Now, I think let's take the individual actions first. I do think that individual actions have a enormous ethical force. Now, you used my not using a cell phone as an example. I think that's a very small one, but the more one can set individual examples, one can set one's individual life in a way that is for oneself, but also becomes an example for others, the more the possibility of that becoming a collective thing. Okay. Um, Mobile phones is one, living without a refrigerator is another one, cycling to work is a third one, etc. I mean, these are small things, and of course I can give you many more examples of what I have not done in my life, which I'm ashamed of. So yes, but I think equally or maybe even more important is to have the collective that enables me to do that, or that actually forces me to do that. So what you're talking about, the peer pressure part of it, right? So as an example, I still, except for the last 1.5 years, still take a lot of flights. Now we in Kalpavriksh we've had 2-3 discussions on a travel policy, and we after all those discussions we built a travel policy where it says that as far as possible, if it's a distance that's not so difficult on train, then to take the train, and only in emergencies to take a flight for that, like 800 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers kind of thing, right? What that does to me is that instead of falling into the convenience of just taking a flight, I will think of saying, okay, but this is what the policy says, or this is what my circle of colleagues and friends is saying, and so let me uh, be a little more inconvenienced to myself and do this, right? So that's again what I was saying earlier about convenience and inconvenience, because I also want their approval, and I agree with the policy. Ethically, fundamentally, it is a policy I agree with, right? So I think that collective then becomes also very important for us to be able to keep pushing our ethical boundaries and limits also. Now, at the macro level, um, this goes back to our earlier, this the first point we were talking about what part of human nature is being appealed to? Is it the selfish, individualized, greedy part, or is it the solidarity, love, generosity, selflessness part? The system, of course, is pushing us in the first one, and is telling us that is also that's, you know, either we forget about morals and ethics, or this is actually what is correct to do or the right thing to do. We need the counter forces at that macro level to tell us that no, in fact, it's more right to, for instance, go cycling rather than taking a fossil fuel car for XYZ reasons, right? We need the iconic figures, and I don't necessarily mean celebrities. It could be a young person who's doing it and then becomes well known because he or she has taken that bold action. It could just be, it could be, for instance, the New Indian Express yesterday taking, or two days back, taking the position that they will not report on IPL because they feel it is shameful that the IPL is even going on in a situation where there's a national medical emergency, right? So when I read that, they put out an ad on that. It gave me that ethical sense, you know, the force to say, yeah, this is something that needs to be done, and hopefully at least another few newspapers will follow suit. So it's that those kinds of actions that also then become public. So there's stuff happening around me in my life, but there's also then that larger macro thing that's happening, which is able to challenge. I remember, was it Prakash Padukone or one of them who actually said, I refuse to do any endorsements and advertisements of commercial products that are bad for health or which are you know, destructive. So you know, individual people like that also standing up to the system and saying, okay, I don't want that money because it is destructive. So yeah, I think that's there. And then bringing back you know, people who we have held in high ethical standing from ancient times, could be religious figures, could be you know, public figures like Gandhi and Ambedkar and so on, or it could be others. It could be an indigenous Native American who has stood up to the might of the American empire and said some fantastic things, or whatever. It could be any of those people. So bringing them back into our lives, but bringing them back not in a moralistic way, not in the way we were taught in school, but in a way of saying, okay, here's what happened. Here's the human part of the person who said this amazing thing. And some of it is coming in fiction. I just finished reading, I was telling you, Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island. Before that, I read this science fiction book called Ministry for the Future and others. And so in entertaining ways, people are bringing these ethics in through stories, through bringing back folk tales, which were always full of ethics. And imagine a whole series of kids' books with these sorts of folk tales, which tell you that, you know, the ethics of living with the tiger in the Sundarbans, or the whatever. I mean, there's so many fascinating, fantastic stories that we have in the world, which go. Oh, it's Kajal joining us. Hi, Kajal.
No, she accidentally entered, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I think we need much more of that. And I think, last point here, the answer has been too long, is that I think the ecological movement, maybe even the human rights movement, has been far too cerebral. It's been trying to appeal to people's minds too much and not to people's hearts. And that's where the right wing has been very good. And the advertising agencies have been, the corporate sector has been very good. So we need to figure out how we can actually get through to people's hearts and have stories that last much longer, which bring the other ethics, the ethics we really want in our lives, back into center stage.
Great. So I'm going to ask, I mean, yeah, as time is moving, there are so many questions, but I'm going to ask a personally salient question. It may seem like a silly question, but for me, it's a very salient question, which is, what is the right relationship with Gandhiji? Right, and Gandhiji in particular, but like our elders in general. Like, to me, Gandhiji feels like this father, and I feel like a son who will always disappoint him, kind of a thing. And the moral pressure of his experiments extends all the way here. At least to me, you can't avoid that, and you have his picture anyways on every currency note, or like there is not a day when you don't encounter something related to him on one end. And that related to that, there are a couple of
That might
questions, right? Huh?
that might be solved soon. Within the next 10-15 years, it'll probably be Modi on all
Ouch.
the currency notes.
Yeah, but yeah, I hope not. But just holding a couple of questions related to Gandhiji and all our elders, and this constant feeling that are we letting them down in the way. So I think one is, why is it so tough to organize in the way they were able to organize at national levels? Like, what's happened? Is it postmodernism that everybody wants to be their own Gandhi, or is it that there is no common struggle, like freedom struggle, that we have? I don't know. So one is, why is it so what the first part, and it's a multi-part question, so any part you can take and respond. So first is, what's the right relationship with Gandhiji, our elders, people who set very high standards for us, and this constant feeling of like we're not living up to that, or like which parts of their experiments should be, like it's a tough one there itself, with his insistence on non-violence and that becoming a credo for people. And we're facing opponents or people who refuse to even negotiate or dialogue or engage. So what are you going to do now? So I think that's one whole piece. What's that right relationship? The second piece is, why is it so tough to organize now? And is it lack of methods? Is it lack of our own inner practices? Like, what's going on there? Why could not something go viral? Why is it so hard for things to go viral? I mean, some answers have come, right? So for example, I guess I underestimate the complexity of doing things and actions. Like, I did a prayer meeting yesterday and I thought it's a simple thing, why can't more people copy it? But then I realized in doing the prayer meeting there are so many sensitivities and responsibilities. Like, it's not just come and do a prayer meeting, and maybe that's why things don't go viral, or we're not able to call for actions. So yeah, so second is, yeah, so one is Gandhiji, what's the right relationship? Second is, like, why is it so tough to organize around things? And the third, last one related to that, is also this question of abundance and scarcity, right? Like, I somehow, in very very limited understanding, when I see Gandhiji's journey, and when I see, say, Tagore's journey, I sometimes see an abundance scarcity kind of a dynamic playing out. Scarcity, or like need greed on one end, and abundance on the other end, kind of a thing, right? And with our generation, I wonder whether will ideal of simple frugality will even work. Like, we are all Mumbaikars, we say, that Bombay School of Social Work, that we've been brought up with a certain level of comfort, and any less than that will just leave us very very, yeah, we'll have to slowly build that capacity if ever, and we have those desires. So just, yeah, I think just if you can contextualize some of that for today's generation, that would help.
This has been a more complex and difficult discussion than I've had for a long time.
Okay, that's
But
great.
it's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. It's good to be able to be challenged in this way, mutually challenged, I think. So, what's the right relationship with elders like Gandhi? I think there are 2-3 things here. One is to firstly take them off their pedestals and understand them as human beings. And like I said, in our schooling, this is what was not done. Everybody was just put up on that pedestal and they were like those perfect human beings, and we had to in some way match them without realizing that they had their own human frailties and weaknesses, which then enables us to look at them as a fellow human being rather than as this superhero who we have to try and emulate in some way. And then that creates the kind of inadequacies or feeling of inadequacies or feeling of guilt or whatever that we have. Now, if we understand them as human beings and understand their weaknesses, understand the struggles that they went through, and that they were not just succeeding but also failing all through their lives, as the really intimate portrayals of them bring out, right? in Gandhi's case, for instance, with regard to how he how he was as a father or as a husband, or with regard to casteism, right? So with Ambedkar, it could be his views on Adivasis, and I don't know very much about his personal life, so I can't say much there. But everybody has their own incredible strengths and also weaknesses and
Challenges.
frailties. And I think if we understand that, then we are able to understand our own lives a little bit better and say that we try harder and harder and harder, but we will also fail. We will succeed in something, we will fail in others, right? So that's one thing. And there to, I think, if we do that, then to say that firstly that we should never stop striving to reach some levels of that kind. Levels could be with regard to honesty, it could be with regard to living frugally, it could be with regard to doing everything we can to make those social transformations happen, being out in the world and doing things and not worrying about maybe COVID will affect me, but I still want to be out and help migrant laborers or whatever that needs to be done right now. Try and do what we can, but not feel, if we are truthful to trying the best that we can, then the failure should not be making us feel guilty or inadequate, because I am what I am, right? And I have my own limits. Everybody has their own limits. And the more we are understanding these amazing people with their own limits, the more we realize that, yes, I also have those limits, right? So I think that's
an
really
important one. Yeah, embracing limits, I think, is a big one.
Yes, exactly. And understanding that those limits are different for every person and every collective. So your limits may not be the same as mine. I shouldn't be saying, oh, why is my limit so much below what Abhishek's is? It's not like that. It is different for every. It's different. Yeah, it's not lower or higher. It's just different.
This is an important one to reach young people also. This message that you just shared, limits, honoring limits, not comparing limits, seeing yourself as unique. I think that's that's an important one. So just want to.
Absolutely. But there also then being honest to it. Because then one should say, oh, I have my limits, so I can't do this. Whereas in fact, we might not even have strived to try or tried to actually go beyond. So that's, I think that's important. The second thing about why is it so tough to organize now? I think this is limited understanding. I think one of the things that's happened now as compared to say 50 years back or 100 years back is that life for us is much more scattered than it may have been at that point. And so civil society is also very scattered. Movements are very scattered in the sense of not just geographically, but which is always the case, but thematically, sector-wise. What we think of, what I think of as important today may be very different from what you think of as very important. And so we're running these parallel movements. Now, if you think of the independence movement, there was one objective in mind, right? And that's been there for all the colonial powers, that you had a single enemy or a single target that you had to all focus on. You could be an animal rights activist, you could be a human rights activist, you could be a feminist, you could even be a right-wing person, you could be anything, but there was that one common thing. And so you all got together and said, okay, let's fight against that. Post-independence, if you recall, Gandhi didn't remain, of course, but I think even if he had, it would have been much more difficult for him to have organized a national level movement, let's say on Swaraj.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So because Swaraj is a way of tackling multiple targets, not enemies. He didn't use the word enemies, but let's say multiple targets, right? Including my own individual weaknesses and failings. Yeah. So which is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to target so many different things. We're trying to change so many different things. We're trying to, and what the system has done to us, this goes back to the earlier part of our conversation, it has made many of us live superficial response lives. that we're responding to a fire here, we're responding to a fire there, we're responding to a crisis here and a crisis there, and either don't have the time or the understanding or the ability to go into the fundamental roots and realize that each of these fires actually has some common roots. Which is what is beginning to happen now with movements, where I think movements are actually saying that whether it is gender violence or it is the crisis of migrant labor or whatever, there are some commonalities in the fundamental structures that we're fighting against. So we need to get together. Whether it's through the Jan Sarokar process or many of the others, there is at least an attempt to do that. But we have been so scattered over the last few decades that it's going to take a long, long time and a lot more effort and some truly charismatic movements to bring, or people to bring things together. I'm hoping that something like COVID and something like the climate crisis, which affects everybody, would give us that sense of unity of purpose, even as there's a diversity of our actions and diversity of objectives, but a unity of a purpose of challenging the fundamental system that's creating this and working towards. And this is where I think the alternatives part becomes so very important, because as long as we're in the negative mode, we're fighting against this, we're fighting against that, I think getting together becomes very difficult. As we move also into saying what is it we're fighting for, we also then have a positive frame of mind in which perhaps we're able to work together better. And I think Vikalp Sangam, in a very minor way, has actually shown that that's possible. At least for the last 6-7 years, we haven't had any serious ego problems and territorial fights and things like that, which is very much the case in the resistance movement space. The third point you're talking about is abundance and scarcity. And again, this is something that the system has told us. Economics is built on notion of scarcity, right? Rather than a notion of abundance. So what would frugal abundance look like?
Frugal abundance. Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
That's not my term. I think I don't know where it's from, but I think I remember it spoken by somebody else, right?
Nice.
What would it look like? What would a notion of enoughness look like, which is also wealthy? Wealth as in not money, but wealth as in well-being.
Yeah.
I think so. Part of it is rescuing words and terms. You know, in the alternative economy, Vikalp Sangam, there was that goddess of wealth, which was not about money. It was about so many other things, about social relationships, about happiness, about my relations with the rest of nature, etc., right? So rescuing terms like wealthy and abundance and so on, but then showing how one can do that without sacrificing the basic comforts, because the notion that we have taught, unfortunately, frugality, etc., is about we have to sacrifice our basic comforts. That doesn't have to be the case. We can show how, in fact, you can live happy, contented, well-being lives with much less material and energy consumption. And we need stories which show that.
Right.
We need the videos, we need the stories, we need the fiction, we need etc., which actually shows how's that possible. I just read Aldous Huxley's couple of months back, his book Island. Have you read that? It's a very interesting sort of semi-utopian novel of an island which has been able to show how, because it was isolated, it actually show how you can actually reach abundance of various kinds, but with a great amount of ecological sensitivity and mutual social sensitivity and simplicity. So, so to destroy the notion that simplicity is about sacrifice, that frugality is about inconveniencing me in all kinds of ways, but that in fact doing this is towards abundance. That is something that we have to show many more stories of. Is it going to be possible? I don't know. I always say that when I was in school, I was told that, and it was imbibed in me by, I think, my parents and my teachers and just the environment around me, that if I didn't use my pencil till like it was this small, and then we used to call it the Gandhi pencil, I was being wasteful. And that was not ethically correct.
Nice.
That's just 2 generations back.
Wow.
So why can't we change it in another 2 generations back to this, showing it's cool to use a pencil till it's this much, and it's
Yeah, yeah,
ecologically responsible,
yeah.
and that there's going to be 100 people looking at me and saying, wow, you're able to do that, that's fantastic, like what you're saying about mobile phones.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, so just keeping time in mind, I'm going to combine two questions as my last question and then maybe come for your final comments. And there's, yeah, I think I'll combine and you can choose which one you want to respond to or both maybe. I think one is earlier in this conversation, you asked me saying, what happened in my life and so that I'm doing what I'm doing. So I want to flip that question to you, particularly in the sense of leadership, right? And I've really looked, I'll try to understand very closely what you do and what you've done, because I see Vikalp as one of those rare processes which has been able to take a very diverse group of people together. And like anybody who's been in the NGO space knows how tough it is to take people together. And I feel Vikalp, we've been able to do that. You've been able to do that. And yeah, collectively, I think that has happened. uh, I don't know whether it's your leadership or is there a lot of people holding different leaderships, like maybe that, because that's happening. But then it's also you've been able to create that space and the rest of it, and uh, so there are things that I've been able to pick up, right? I've been able to see deep listening, I've been able to see humility, I've been able to see patience, I've been able to see depth of understanding, dialogue. I still have questions of saying that if we have to cultivate leadership now over, say, a long horizon of 15, 20, 25 years, uh, what would you say for an 18-year-old that we are collectively building leadership for? Say it's a Gen Z, 18-year-old Gen Z who's born into a charged world, Trump, Modi era, ready to do something. And my daughter says that Gen Z will challenge the police but feel embarrassed to ask for extra ketchup. That's her analysis. That Gen Z is strong but also equally and very sensitive mental health wise. And I mean that's a whole. So I think what are those 2 3 things, if you could zoom in to say, if we get these 2 3 things right for developing or supporting the next generation of people, we will have a lot more people who are able to do, say, what you're able to do or what some of you are able to do. So what is that? So that's kind of one broad question. And the related second question is around the NGO complex, if I have to use that word, in the sense that a lot of it seems extension of the system itself, right? It just seems like capitalism has creeped into the NGO space and is just pretending to do good a lot of times. And that whole challenge with the movement space, people who are not necessarily people who are independently as active citizens, struggling, doing things, and really building something around that, right? What could be Is that a possibility you see even of audit, quote unquote, like non-social workers or people coming together, and this whole notion of billionaire philanthropy and foundation money and what that does? And so I think just the question around movements, saying that instead of them being very niche, say whatever 10,000 people in India, how do they go to at least a few lakh people in India, if not 10,000? Like what is stopping that? And is it, yeah, so is it funds or not? Funds is a problem, not funds is the answer. I don't know what. So I think two broad questions. One is leadership question, which got many sub questions, and second is a structural question of saying, what do we want to see more people? I mean, I know pluriversally you would say that we need all types, kind of a thing, but also if you could zoom into the NGO movement space and that dichotomy, and like what do you see as emerging answers there as a way forward? I think, yeah, these two I thought I'll put, and then I'll come back to you for your final comments. But yeah, these two.
So I think, I mean, as you know, I'm uncomfortable with the term leadership, but anyway, whatever, let's
Yeah.
say,
Anchoring, let's say,
yeah,
pegging,
yeah, enablers or anchors or
pegs.
whatever, yeah,
Yeah.
pegs. um, I don't know. I mean, I think I've been lucky that whatever has come naturally to me, maybe because of my upbringing or my all the influences I had as a child and as a young person. But one of the things that is very deeply ingrained in me is to respect everybody around me as people of their own people who are worthy in their own right. People who have their own talent, their own creativity, their own ability to contribute to a collective process. This basic respect, I think, is what leads me to listen and not impose. I don't think I'm always successful in not imposing. I think I still it still happens, but at least to try. I think that's one very fundamental thing that we and that relates also to how we are being brought up. What is it that our education system, our parents or whoever is telling us? And unfortunately, it's mostly not. We're not brought up to understand or to respect everybody else, and to understand that everybody has their own abilities, etc. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is to always understand one's own limits. It's related to the first one, but it's also different. To understand that I have, however intelligent or capable I might think of myself, I have my limits. And if I understand that, then I will again be listening to people around me, because my limits can get overcome, or the shortcomings I have can be overcome by somebody else's strengths. Yeah. And so therefore, enabling positions are those which don't think of themselves as the ones who have the answers always, but not also the other extreme of thinking oneself as being so completely answerless that you're always only listening to others. I have my answers, but I'm also understanding that others have their own answers, and it's in that open, respectful listening space that will come to a collective answer or collective understanding. So I think that that is the second thing of understanding one's own limits, really being able to, and the third is, maybe again it's related to the first two, is that collectives will always be more powerful than the individual. And building that collective space means that and respecting the first two, understanding the first 2 points means that that collective space has to be horizontal. It can't be a hierarchical space. It can't be where one person or one group is dominating over the others. Because if you do that, then the first 2 elements get knocked out. I mean, we see that with Modi's style of leadership, for instance, right now, very, very strongly. So, I mean, there are probably other elements too, but I'm just saying that these are
good ones. Yeah, these are great pointers. I think these are quite fundamental.
Then, with respect to the NGO space, I think the NGO space has gone completely haywire. Partly it's the money, but partly also it's this, what the system is telling each one of us individually is also, of course, getting imbibed by NGOs, that we are the ones who should be the ones that are well known out there. We are the ones who need to have all the money. We are the ones who need to have the power to make that happen. And if that means, for instance, finding our allies in the corridors of power and using all sorts of dubious means to get our ends met, then we will do that. And so the NGO world definitely is prone to all of these things. I had actually written an article, I think some 15-20 years back, on the empires that are being set up in the NGO world. And I want to republish it now, because I'm just waiting for a space and a time when it's timely and appropriate, because right now is not the time to criticize one's own colleagues. But because I could see the signs of that already beginning to happen, right? I mean, of course, there wasn't so much money, there wasn't nearly so much attention and ability to become famous overnight at that point. But nevertheless, There was already, even in fact, when Kalpavriksh was set up, it was beginning to happen, the desire to set up empires. But yeah, so I think, how does one then overcome this and build more of a organization, movement, collective spaces? One thing that needs to happen much more is some kind of peer auditing. I think you use the word audit, but yeah, so the sort of peer pressure, peer auditing. Now, like the alternatives transformation format that we've helped to develop, partly arising from the Vikalp Sangam process, is where every NGO, every movement can self-audit. If we really believe in equity, equality, if we really believe in justice, we really believe in sustainability, how much of that are we ourselves practicing, right? Is something that we can use a tool like that to do, but where we can also do it for each other, but in a constructive manner. We can do it, Kalpavriksh can maybe do it for BRM can do it for Kalpavriksh, or with each other. We did that with the Wankars, the handloom weavers in Kutch. We used that format where they were also part of the whole thing. So there's some internal questioning also happening with regard to some of the issues that we found. So we I think we have to do much more of that. And what that does is actually that makes us collectively stronger also against the attacks that the system is making on us, because it's pointing to our weaknesses and saying, look, the NGO world is corrupt, the NGO world has sexual harassment, the NGO. So who are they to tell us what to do? It's very easy for the government to actually point these things out. You know, out of 1,000 FCRA organizations, there will be 5 that is doing all kinds of hera-feri, and so they'll point to these 5, and then they'll paint another 50 or the whole 1,000. And unless we have those self-corrective mechanisms within us, rather than somebody else doing it, imposing it on us, we are going to be opened up to these kinds of things. But also, and this is the second crucial point here, is that the NGO space needs to give way. I'm talking about the professional, urban, middle class NGO space needs to give up the space that is needed to the mobilizations of those who are most marginalized. That is the civil society space, the people's movement space that needs to become much more centered, and where people like us then become supporters of them, or enablers, or enhancers of their voice, rather than being, occupying that center space. So, for instance, suppose we have spaces available, say, in policy making. Yeah, of course, with the BJP, there's no space at all. But say previously there was the, what is it called, the National Advisory Committee or Council or whatever. There are spaces like that, or some of the other sort of committees and things like that, where suppose I'm getting a chance to be on that committee, or it doesn't have to be government, could be other things like a webinar. Just last week, I was invited to a webinar on Adivasi perspectives, etc. And when I saw the list of speakers, I said, but there's no Adivasi on this. Who am I to? I can be there, but there needs to be at least 2 or 3 Adivasi speaking, and then I can either speak on in their support, or maybe constructively criticize them or whatever. But I can't now. So how do we give up those spaces ourselves voluntarily and say, no, here's a Dalit who should be there, or here's an Adivasi who should be there, or here's a woman who should be there, rather than men speaking on behalf of women. So that, I think, is very, very, we've lost, we don't do that enough. We have to be able to do that. Okay.
And that's also the internalized capitalist system in some ways. We seeking our fame, we seeking our attention, or like in a covert way, but the underlying structure is still the same. We're still extensions of the same system we claim to resist.
And it's very convenient for the system, because they are so much more easily able to co-opt people like us. Or if not co-opt, because some of us may not be co-optable, it's very easy for them to say, "To tum kya Adivasi ki baat kar rahe ho? Tum to Adivasi ho bhi nahi." Who are you to speak on behalf of migrant labor? You're not a migrant labor, etc. So it becomes easy for the system to undermine.
What's coming to me, Ashish, is also what you have developed in terms of the petals and then this framework is almost a pathway to building ethical power. Because if somebody is theoretically gone through this process and does this, then they are fairly robust. They're resilient. They're not easy to mess around with because they've gone. So I'm also seeing this as a pathway for NGOs and movements to literally be clean and have that stature or have that. Yeah.
Correct. So the credibility and also then the greater collective strength. Because when you establish that kind of credibility, which is an ethical credibility, then you have much more of a possibility of another 100 movements supporting you when you're in trouble. But if you're basically established yourself as this lone, that alpha male kind of thing as an NGO,
Right.
then there's going to be much fewer people who would be rallying around you if you're in trouble. So I think that's really important.
Nice.
So what was that? Yeah, these are the 2 points, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
For the NGO space. Cool. That's good, Ashish. I think that's a lot there. I am going to do a closing comments from you, and also if you want to name some conversations, like I think one conversation I would like to name is definitely to sit with you on a. I mean, it's an intention I'm seeding whenever that happens, but to sit with you on the petals and the framework and make that accessible in one podcast. If some or can just get a teaser or a starter, I definitely love to do that. I definitely love to do something around if there is a possibility of a centrist movement or something that's pluralistic and something that is attempting to bring together people to dialogue. Is it even possible in today's polarized times? And I think that's so. Any closing comments and any conversations you would like to name that we could have or people need to have?
Well, I think all the issues and questions you raised are points for much further, deeper, wider conversations. So I wouldn't know. I think maybe something that we keep coming back to is the ethics part in all of this. Whether it's individual actions or it's NGOs or it's the notion of what do we learn from our elders, how do we treat each other, how do we self-evaluate. I think a lot of this boils down to the set of ethical principles and values that we hold or could hold or should hold. So I think maybe we could go deeper in, what is truth, what is love, what is generosity, what is solidarity, what is diversity, what is autonomy, and what is nonviolence, and how do we, but not in abstract ways. I mean, and sort of ground them in everyday experience. Yeah. And how do we deal, because sometimes there are contradictions between them. How do we deal with those? So I think if we can have more conversations on that, and if we can use the alternatives transformation format, because it also has a set of ethics and principles as a way of doing that, then I think that would be fantastic. We did the first time when we actually used it in a very partial way was when 5 of the civil society groups that were together at the Western Himalaya, first Western Himalaya Vikalp Sangam in 2017, I think it was, up in Sambhavna in Himachal, is where 4 or 5 of the groups said, okay, we're going to apply that to ourselves publicly, okay, in the open space with all the 25-30 people listening. And that was a very interesting experience, right? Then we did it within ourselves for Kalpavriksh, and then we used it with the Vankars in Kutch. But if we can get, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 groups, say from the Vikalp Sangam, saying, okay, we're willing to do this. Obviously, right now it will have to be online. But that would be fascinating over a couple of hours or 3 hours if we actually say, okay, how do we evaluate ourselves? But to do it, with people outside of the organizations who are willing to listen respectfully and give constructive critical comments. So maybe we can go there.
That would be a nice one. Great, Ashish. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a couple of hours almost now.
Yeah, I didn't realize.
Time has flown, and there's been such a rich conversation. Feeling a lot of gratitude for just you sharing so many things. It's been very, very educational and informative. Thank you.
Thanks for opening this up. I think these are the sorts of conversations we don't nearly have enough of.
Yes, totally.
So
and here's to more, hopefully, to come back. Thank you.